this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair HX1500i. In this video I'm going to be unboxing and showing what's included with this 1500 watt power supply unit, and showing you the setup process for it, where you're meant to plug in all the cables, and what cables are for what. I'm also going to be covering Corsair's 600 watt PCIe Gen 5 adapter cable, which is used for NVIDIA's RTX 40 series graphics cards, and where you'd sort that out and plug that in this power supply unit so you can use the most powerful GPUs around currently and set that up. I'm going to show you the setup process in a case and where you plug things in and what you need to do as we go through. Now, this is a modular power supply unit and an interesting one for a number of reasons. Obviously, it's very powerful, but it also comes with IQ connectivity because it has a USB cable, USB-C cable that connects up to your motherboard, that then allows you to control it in various ways via Corsair's IQ software. You don't have to do that though, you don't have to connect that up if you don't want to. And as you'll see, it also includes a very different power cable for the mains connection. It's not standard, so that's worth keeping in mind. Now, it is a modular power supply unit, which as you can see has multiple different ports for multiple different things, mass of PCIe connections. This thing comes with 3 PCIe 8-pin connections, which is 6x2, which is a straight connection, and then 3 more PCIe 8-pin connections with that sort of Y splitter on them as well. You also see a mass of other cables, and I'll leave all of them in the description so you can see what's included, but you can see just how many are included here, and there are a lot. You've got SATA, PATA, obviously PCIe, the 24-pin power supply cable for your motherboard, and CPU as well, so multiple CPU cables. So I'm going to show you where those plug in and what's what as we go through this. So I just want to demonstrate each of them and also what you get with it. So you can see that you have these CPU cables. Those connect up to usually the top left of your motherboard, and I'll show you where in a minute. Those are 8-pin CPU power cables for your motherboard, and if you're using a motherboard like high-end motherboard with overclocking, you might need to plug in multiples of those. Then you also have the PCIe cables. These are for graphics cards generally, and you'll find that there are a lot of them in here. So if you're buying a 40 series graphics card or a high-end graphics card, you'll probably need 2 or 3 or more of these, and you'll see there are a lot of them. Some of them are the straight ones, so it's just one connection on each end, and others have one connection and then 2 connectors on the other end, so you actually have sort of a Y splitter set up there, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But basically those connect up to your GPU and give you the power that you need for that. And then you have these flat SATA power connectors. These are for hard drives, SSDs, fan power connections, case connectors if you have power on your case for some reason, like RGB lighting strips and things like that. So you have those connections. Then you have the 24-pin motherboard connection. This is one of the most important because it will give all the power to your motherboard and allow your PC to turn on, so you need to make sure you use that. You'll see that's quite a chunky beast. And then you have PATA connections. These are used for things like liquid cooling pumps and other things. Sometimes you will find that in most builds you probably won't end up using that. And then you have a USB-C connection, USB-C on one end and USB on the other, that will connect up to your motherboard, and that's for Corsair's control. And then the power cable, which as you can see is quite unusual, is a bit chunky on one end, quite different from the usual sort of kettle connection that you'd have. Now, I'm going to show you the steps for each of these and where they'd connect up. So the 24-pin motherboard connection has 2 connectors on one end, and you'll see that connects up in the top right here, and it basically splits into 2, but clips in there. As I said, this is the most important. You need to make sure this one's well seated, both in the PSU and on the motherboard. Otherwise, it won't boot up, even if you've connected everything else up as you should. It is a bit of a chunky monster, and you can see just how thick it is, so you do need to manipulate it into your case in order to connect it up. I'm going to show you the process for doing it outside the case so it's more visible and where you'd plug things in. So this is a demo motherboard, and you can see on the right hand side, that's where you'd connect it up there. They're usually in the same place, so top right hand side, and it connects up like that. Don't do this outside the case normally, obviously put everything together and then plug it in. But what you'll find is that's a bit of a chunky monster to get into place. Then you have the CPU connection. So these are marked CPU, and it's worth noting where it has that markings is actually where it connects up. The other end is what you plug into the power supply, not the one with the CPU markings on it. But you can see PCIe/CPU connection labeling in the top left here, for example. Connect it up. Now I have 2 of these 8-pin connections on my motherboard, and they connect up in the top left. You may well find that there's an additional one or two, depending on your motherboard. If you've bought an extreme motherboard that requires a lot of power for overclocking, then you might find extras, but those plug in the top left there. And again, demo of that. And then you'll find the SATA connections, and these have a flat daisy chainable connection, and you'll see they plug in the bottom right where it says SATA and PATA. And you can't plug these in wrong because they only have 6 connectors on the end that plug into the PSU instead of 8. And then the other end of them you connect up to things like SSDs. So you'll see a 2.5-inch Kingston SSD here, for example. They also work with hard drives and fan connectors and other things like that too. Now, a quick note about Corsair's PCIe Gen 5 600 watt adapter. This is a special cable that's been released for NVIDIA's 40 series, and it's bought separately, so it doesn't come with this PSU, but I think it's worth bearing in mind. If you're buying this, you're probably thinking about getting a high-end graphics card as well. This basically is a cable that allows you to adapt and plug into those 40 series GPUs, because those GPUs have a special connector on the end which basically usually takes all the different cables and puts them into one. So usually you get an included cable with your graphics card which takes 4 PCIe 8-pin cables, and they prefer the straight ones, so usually the ones that don't have the daisy chain bit on it, and puts them into an adapter that then goes into this one 600 watt connector. And instead, now you have this Corsair one, which basically replaces the usual PCIe cables that you have included with this power supply unit. And what it does instead is it gives you 2 PCIe connections on the power supply end, and then one 600 watt connector that goes into your graphics card. This is a lot neater than NVIDIA's solution, because it means you don't have a mass of cables coming into the front of your PC and then 4 different connectors that you have to worry about, where you need to connect up 4 different 8-pin power supply cables to it. Instead, you're just plugging in 2 PCIe connections, as you usually would with a Type 4 adapter, that then connect up to that 600 watt, which you can see here, a flat connector that then plugs into the graphics card. This is a much neater solution and a preferred one if you're using a Corsair PSU. This will work with a number of different Corsair PSUs, and I'll leave a link in the description so you can check which are compatible, but obviously it will work with this one that I'm showing off here. It may well be, of course, that you don't have a 40 series graphics card, and this is a 3090 from Gigabyte, an OC Vision card. I'm going to show you the steps for that. Now, this requires 2 8-pin PCIe connections. So you connect up the one end, obviously, of those 2 long cables. So use the 2 that don't have the daisy chain bit on them and connect those up. And in this case, I'm using, obviously, the strimmer cables. These are RGB cables, but you would follow the same process. So you'd use those 2 cables, run them through to the front, and then plug them in. You'll notice they're split from 8-pin into 6 and 2, because some graphics cards require just 6 connectors. This requires 2 8-pins, so you have to kind of push those together and then insert them in. It's the same logic whether you're using the strimmers like I am or Corsair's power supply cables, but it's the long 8-pin PCIe cables, and as I said, use the straight ones rather than the ones with the daisy chain for maximum power through to your GPU. Now, once they're all plugged in, it is easier to plug all these cables in before you try and put it in the case, by the way, because as you'll see, if you have a case like I do, which is the Lian Li Dynamic Evo, it is a bit difficult to get the cables in after the PSU is in place, and also there's a mass of cables to deal with. Now, this will vary depending on what you're connecting up, obviously. If, for example, you don't need all those CPU connections, then you won't need to have quite as many things in there. I also have to have a lot of SATA connections in here because I'm going to be using RGB cables, as you'll see at the end of this video. So make sure you only plug in what you really need to before you get started. It'll make life a lot easier. Also, if you ensure that you've plugged in all the cables you need, you won't then need to try and reach your hand into a tiny space to put in extra cables. So it's well worth checking beforehand, checking your motherboard, see how many connections you need on there, think about how many drives you're installing, fan connectors, RGB cables and things like that. Anything that's going to require extra SATA power or extra other connections, how many connectors your graphics card requires, things like that. You don't want to try and force those cables in once the PSU is mounted into place. You screw it in with the 4 screws that are included in the box, and then you try and feed the cables in the right direction. You can see me, for example, putting the CPU cables up to the top, and then I'm connecting up the necessary power cables. This includes the SSDs, but also this case has power for RGB lighting and also other things. And then you're going to see that I'm using the standard PCIe 8-pin connectors, which have a 6 connector and then an extra 2 that you need to squeeze together. And I'm putting those into Leon, these strimmer cables. So these are RGB cables essentially that work to pass through power from your PSU to your graphics card, or as you'll also see, the 24-pin power cable on the case as well. So those need to be powered and plugged in, and they basically run the power through there. They don't connect up directly to the power supply unit. They require to be connected up to the standard power cables that are included. Now, once everything's put into place, don't forget, obviously you need the 24-pin and also the top CPU power connections. Make sure they're all seated correctly, plugged in nice and tight, and clipped in as they should be. And then you should find everything set up and ready to go. You then have yourself a hopefully nice working PC, and you can turn it on and enjoy the glory of your build. Now, if you're interested, I've done a video separately on this case and a build guide on it if you want to see a bit more in-depth steps on all the different things rather than just the PSU. So check out the links in the description to find out more. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this useful. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Thanks very much for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.